Welcome back to our mini-series on meditation for beginners. Last week we've already looked at how we can start to make our mind independent of the ups and downs of the circumstances around us. And this week we're going to be looking at the effect of what we call the 5 hindrances on the mind and how they manage to rob us of the happiness which really we ought to have automatically as part of our human nature. Did you know that in fact smiling uses less muscles in your face than frowning? But isn't it strange that even though smiling uses less muscles, it's very often the case that looking around us in the world we see very few people smiling. Really, the fact that it uses less muscles in our face would tell us that the natural state of being of all of us humans is to be happy. Then why is it that we don't manage to feel happiness the whole of the time? What is it that comes in the way of our happiness? Part of this answer will come to us if we start to meditate more, because some of the obstacles which we meet in the course of our meditation practice are exactly the same obstacles as the ones which stop us from feeling the happiness which is our real birthright as a human being. The obstacles in the mind are in fact not a part of the mind itself, because if you were to look at the mind, it's rather like a clear crystal sphere, or rather like this clear water which you see in the drinking glass which I'm holding up at the moment. It allows you a clear picture of the world around you without any distortion and without any colouring. This is how the mind ought to be. But when we come in contact with negative emotions in the world around us, we tend to lose this clarity of our mind, so that our perception and our understanding of the world around us is distorted by the effect of what we call hindrances or defilements in the mind. In fact, there are 3 major groups of such impurities in the mind, and what I'd like to do today is to introduce you to each one of these in turn, which are greed, hatred, and delusion, each of which have different effects on the mind and different seriousness of the effects on the mind as well. The first one I'd like to talk about today is the effect of greed on the mind. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to put a drop of ink in our beautiful clear mind, and let's see what happens to our perception of the world. Well, what we see happening is that the mind is becoming clouded by a new color. Although there's still some of the clarity left in the mind, what we find is that our perception of the world is starting to be tainted by the greed in the mind itself. If we look at the greed, we can see that in fact we're still able to see the world through the veil of greed in the mind. But if you think about how long it's going to take for all this ink in the water to separate out again, you'll realize that greed has the characteristic of having a very long-term effect in the mind. And this is intuitive to anyone who's suffered from greed or desire in the form of a heartbreak. You know how long that can linger in the mind. When we come to meditate, the way in which greed affects us can sometimes be in a very literal way. If we're thinking about what we're going to have for dinner that day, then it may be greed which is distracting us from our meditation. But in fact, a more subtle form of greed is the greed for results itself in meditation. This can be something which can be a big obstacle for our progress in meditation. The more we want progress, then the less easy it is for us to get progress. If we have too much greed or desire for results in our meditation, often we find that we have tension on our forehead or across our shoulders as a result, just from trying too hard. If you find that you have this in your meditation, then you have to try to relax more, release all the tension in yourself, and to meditate in a less results-orientated way. On the other hand, there are some people who have no desire at all for progress in their meditation, and this can also be a problem when we come to meditate. Some people make no effort or no earnest in their meditation, and what they find is that they let their mind wander without end, something which we call absent-mindedness, where they just allow their thoughts to wander here and there without focusing on the object of their meditation at all. Again, this is counterproductive. It's like having a little bit too little greed in one's meditation, and this doesn't allow us to meditate very well either. Worse than that, there are those who are so inattentive to their meditation that they can fall asleep altogether. And if you are so lethargic about your meditation, then it's difficult to imagine you making any progress at all. If you do find that you're feeling sleepy in your meditation, traditionally speaking, in Buddhism, we have 8 ways of dealing with sleepiness. The first way is to make a little bit more effort to concentrate, maybe by repeating the word Samma Arahang to yourself a little faster than usual. Secondly, you might like to think over the meditation techniques which you have learned in the past. If you revise these in your mind, then you'll find it'll wake you up. The third thing is to try explaining the teachings to others. Sometimes making the effort to explain these things to others will help you to wake up more and be more attentive. A fourth thing, if that fails, is to try giving your face and body a good rub with the palm of your hand like this. If you can do that, then it will find that it'll wake you up, perhaps restore you to a little bit more liveliness. If that doesn't work, then maybe you need to stand up, wash your face, drink some water, and maybe have a look at the stars or anything bright which will help you to feel a little bit more awake. If that doesn't work for you, then maybe you have to think of brightness, maybe by thinking of the brightness inside yourself a little bit more, or go to a more bright place where you're going to be shaken out of your lethargy. If that doesn't work for you, maybe you should try walking meditation, the details of which you may find later on in this program. And if all that else fails, then you may actually need a little bit more rest than you've already had. But if you do go down to sleep, don't give up your idea of meditation completely. You should lay down to sleep on your right side with the intention in your mind that you're going to wake up in an hour or two in order to continue with your meditation. If you do that, then you normally find that you will wake up on time and you'll be refreshed and ready to meditate a little bit better. The second sort of impurity in the mind is rather the equivalent of what we call boiling water in the mind. If you imagine here that the bubbles which are flowing up inside the drinking glass here are not coming from the calcium medicine, but from the heat of the water itself boiling over and sizzling inside this glass, then you get a fair idea of what the effect is of hatred or anger in the mind. Again, we can see that this is a very violent reaction which is taking place. And for as long as it's going on, it's very difficult to find any clarity in the mind at all. This is equivalent to the way in which anger or hatred can affect our thinking. If we're under the influence of anger, there are untold damaging things which we can do under its influence. But yet, as soon as the anger is over, it returns to normal almost as quickly as it started. And this is why sometimes when we've been very angry and we get over our anger, sometimes we couldn't believe how we could have been so angry or have done the things we did when we were angry, because it comes and goes so suddenly. Thus, the characteristic of this defilement in the mind, the defilement of the impurity of anger or hatred, is that it can be very damaging while it's in effect, but we get over it quickly. What sort of anger do we meet up with when we're meditating? Well, of course, it can be because we're angry with something or somebody in the world. But more common than that is anger against the things which we don't like when we're meditating. Things like the pains which we may feel in our legs. If we struggle to fight back against the pain which we're experiencing sitting cross-legged for the first time, often that will be such a distraction in itself that it will cause us to have this stirred up feeling in our mind. What can we do if we find such a thing? Well, if it's to do with pain in your legs, then the best thing is not to try to fight back against it. Try to keep your neutralness of mind, and in that case you'll find that you can allow your mind to simmer down a little bit more. If you have a tendency to anger in your personality, what you may find is that learning the practice of what we call meditation on loving kindness will help you to have a better ability to cope with your anger in a more long-term sense. The last but not least, because it's also a very serious impurity of the mind, is the effect of what we call delusion. And delusion can be compared to something like putting sand or mud in a glass of water. What we see here is that it completely clouds up the mind to a point where the mind has virtually no clarity left at all. in order to see clearly in the world. When this happens, you can say it's a very serious way in which the efficiency of the mind deteriorates. For as long as we still have this ignorance in the mind or delusion in the mind, it can be very damaging for us. And if you think about how long it's going to take for this sand to disappear altogether, then I think you'd agree it's also going to be a very long time. So what can we do about this? What appears to be both a very serious and also a very long-term element in the mind. The thing we can do is that we can meditate more by making the mind more tranquil, and gradually we allow the rubbish of the sand to settle out and become a precipitate at the bottom of the glass. When that happens, we start to have a little bit more clarity in the mind, by which we can start to see the world clearly, see the delusions which we have in the mind, and take some action about those things. In the beginning, maybe we're just able to see what we call the defilements of delusion in the mind, but it's still better than not knowing that we don't know. Later on, as we become more adept in our meditation, we can use the meditation itself to actually start to get rid of some of that delusion in the mind. But we have to be able to see it in the first place before we can start to work on it. So we see that, basically speaking, we have three sorts of defilements in the mind: the greed, the hatred, and the delusion. When you come to meditate, normally you find that greed gives rise to 3 of the 5 hindrances of the mind. That is sense desire, or gamacchanta. Also it gives rise to absent-mindedness of the mind, ukkacca kukucca. And it also can give rise to sleepiness of the mind when you have not enough greed. That is tina mitta in the Pali language. As for anger, this gives rise to one of the 5 hindrances, which is vengefulness or bhayapada in the mind. And last but not least, there is the delusion in the mind, which gives rise to doubt, which we call vicikicca in the Pali language. When we are meeting up with doubts in the mind, this means that we have a never-ending set of questions in the mind. And the way we get rid of that in our meditation is to not encourage the questions to go on one after the other. So today we've looked at 3 different sorts of groups of defilements in the mind, and also the 5 hindrances. There's just one more sort of strange experiences which you may come across in the course of your meditation, for those of you who have tried it for yourself, which are experiences like sometimes while we're meditating, suddenly feeling very light or very heavy, feeling as if our body is expanding, or suddenly feeling as if all the bodily hair is standing on end, or sometimes feeling intensely hot or intensely cold, or sometimes even crying. Some people might wonder what category these sort of obstacles will fit into in a meditation, and exactly how to deal with these. Because sometimes it can be quite a frightening experience to have such unexpected experiences when meditating. If you find this is the case for you, what you may find useful is to try pretending that you're not interested in these experiences. Because what they all have in common is that they are showing that your mind is starting to come to a standstill. If you have such experiences, whether it's feeling hot or cold or hungry or whatever, which is a very surprising and intense experience for yourself, is that you should try pretending that you're not interested in those experiences. And by doing that, you can go on to pass through these experiences. If you suddenly become very interested in these sort of experiences, what you will find is that you never get past those experiences anymore. In fact, they are subtle forms of the delusion, which we talked about in the last group of the defilements of the mind. But in fact, how we deal with them is not by meditating on them, but in fact by pretending we're not interested in them. So hopefully today, as a result of our studies of the 3 different forms of defilements and the 5 different sorts of hindrances, you have a little bit more idea about how to deal with the obstacles which you come up against in the course of your meditation. If you can overcome all 5 of the hindrances, what you'll find is that you'll reach a state of mind which is called one-pointedness of mind. By any other word, we call it the standstill of the mind, which is in fact our real goal in the initial stages of our meditation. So try it and see it for yourself, what sort of obstacles you come across in your meditation. Try to deal with them in the appropriate way already mentioned, and hopefully you'll find that you can make progress without ending your meditation. So in the meantime, try to keep up your meditation every day and free your mind of worries, fit meditation into your daily routine, be observant, and hopefully you can put into practice all the things which I have been talking about today. So see you next week.
Monks devote themselves to spiritual training. As a layperson or holder of 5 precepts, we always defer our respect to those who hold more precepts than us, or 227. So it's customary to show respect for one who has adopted a greater number of rules for training.